We're so pleased is for many of us an in-person event at last and again, which is so lovely for us to start gathering together again as a community. For those of you who are online, we also want to welcome you. It's great that we have you with us virtually, and we know it's Wellbeing Week, so you may be interpreting wellbeing as being able to be home but still joining us, which is fantastic. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we're joining you, the Gadigal and Bejigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to acknowledge them as the first educators on this site, the ones who had a wonderful oral history and tradition of passing knowledge from generation to generation, and I hope whom we can continue to emulate as we look to educate future citizens of Australia, future learners of Australia. Many of them are already citizens. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander elders who may be present here in the room and joining us today. This lecture is actually part of the UNSW Centre Education Academy series, and which is aimed to highlight the strategies and thought leadership of our outstanding educators. The fellows who form the Academy provide leadership and vision through their own teaching and their mentoring of colleagues. These lectures too are part of a broader series of educational events that are offered from the PVC ESE portfolio, but these are the only ones that are actually open to the public. And we have had a series of lectures before this, and there are recordings of those that you can find on the SEA website if you would like to go back and review some outstanding lectures around education and thought leadership in that space. As you know, we now have a vibrant EF community at UNSW, and one of the endeavours that we have initiated with the sponsorship of our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Merlin Crossley, whom you'll hear from at the end of this presentation, is the Visiting Teaching Fellowship Scheme. Each faculty has the opportunity to invite a distinguished educator to visit UNSW, to share their insights and best practices around education and the student experience, and also to help build those essential external connections for our educators that we need so that we can grow these into meaningful, ongoing collaborations. And of course, for those of us who think about promotion, it's also a wonderful way to identify and build connections for referees. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Nalini Paitha. Nalini is Associate Dean Education for Innovation and the Academic Lead for the Medicine Program Redesign in the Faculty of Medicine and Health. Nalini is also the Co-Director and Fellow of our UNSW Centre Education Academy, who are hosting this event. And we are hoping that this will serve as the pilot for many of the other visiting teaching fellows from other faculties to come and join us in the Scientia Education Lecture Series. So I'd like to hand over to Nalini to introduce our wonderful visiting teaching fellow.
Thank you, Louise, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Scientia Education Academy. I am the director of the Academy, together with my colleague and friend, Professor Patsy Polly, who is sitting there next to Louise. And also extending Louise's fantastic acknowledgement of country, I want to also acknowledge our traditional owners of the land as the first healers that were operating on these lands. And being from medicine and health, that is probably an important thing for us to remember today too. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor Karen Hauer. Karen is the Associate Dean for Competency Assessment and Professional Standards and the Professor of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She designs and leads the program of assessment at UCSF School of Medicine and directs the school's medical student coaching program, which we're very keen to hear more about. She's an active researcher in medical education and a research mentor for fellows, residents, students, and faculty with a focus on competency-based medical education, learner assessment, equity in assessment, coaching, and remediation. In 2015, she completed a PhD in medical education through a joint program of UCSF and the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. She is active on leadership committees and on the National Board of Medical Examiners and the Macy Foundation, and is also an editor of the journal Medical Education. Karen joins us today because of the hospitality of the School of Clinical Medicine, and especially Arvin, who is hosting Karen in this next 2 weeks. So thank you, Arvin, for sharing your guest with us today. And Karen, please take the stage and tell us about grade or not grade, such an important topic in this time of our institution.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It's truly an honor to be here with all of you today. And as was mentioned, I'm visiting here from San Francisco, California. Our hospital is based in San Francisco, or our set of hospitals, and then I live just north over the Golden Gate Bridge. When we think about grading, assessment, and our approach to learning, we think about our context, just as I'm sure you do here. And I think there are actually many similarities between Sydney and San Francisco as I'm getting to know your beautiful location. I will say you get a lot more rain than we do, so I need to take some home with me to California. In our location, as we began to wrestle with the question about grading, we really felt like it was a big challenge, and we held events like you're holding today where we brought our community together. We were mindful that we care for a very diverse patient population in San Francisco and in the state of California, and we admit an increasingly diverse set of medical students. In the past 2 years, over half of our students in the incoming classes identify as coming from backgrounds underrepresented in medicine based on their race, ethnicity. So in many ways, our students are ahead of the faculty in thinking about what will serve their learning and their skills development best, what will shape their habits of mind to help them be lifelong learners as physicians. So we really wrestled with the same tension that you're thinking about, and I'm learning a lot from the discussions I've already had with some of you today. When we were approaching the time to make our grading change, we brought together our department chairs, our clinical program leaders, and our education experts, and we asked them to imagine this student in red and what might be going through their mind as they were learning in our clinical education program. In a graded environment, the student in red might be thinking about, how do I stay ahead of my peers? How do I look better? How do I hide my weaknesses so that I can stay top on the ladder? If we were to shift our focus away from that performance orientation, this student in the middle might be thinking, what do I need to do to get to the next ladder, rung on this ladder of medical expertise? Or maybe they would think, how could I help the students on either side of me get to the next rung on their ladder? So this brings in the concept of assessment for learning. How can assessment be used to help people learn more, gather the feedback that they need to continue growing? We won't get rid of assessment of learning, which is the assessment that feels like a test or a high-stakes assessment, but how can we move toward greater focus on assessment for learning? And to our faculty, we would say, if you're a frontline teacher, what's your role in that process? All teachers want to help their students not feel scared and nervous about the next assessment, but want to feel that they've made an impact on that learner and their growth. So we would like our faculty to embrace their role in assessment for learning. There are many purposes of assessment. Our students might say, well, assessment is a test, but assessment serves lots of purposes for the learner. We want to draw their attention to the way that assessment provides them feedback and reinforces their learning, guides what they're going to work on next. And then, periodically, assessment will be used to figure out if they've met expectations or what grade or standing they might receive. And assessment for the program is very important to make sure that we're doing what we set out to do, that will satisfy our higher-ups and our accreditors. And we use assessment to make decisions about who will get graduated, who will get admitted to a residency or a fellowship program. And increasingly, I think we're all learning about the concept of quality assurance and continuous quality improvement. How can we use aggregate assessment data to figure out where we need to change or grow our program? In the United States, the students are heavily focused on one purpose of assessment, which is how will it help me get the residency spot that I want after medical school? And while we want them to be motivated, that's a very powerful external motivator that can actually interfere with the kind of question asking, feedback seeking that we want them to embrace as part of their practice. So with our examination of different approaches to assessment and grading, we're not going to eliminate this purpose of assessment, but we're trying to balance out the learning-oriented purposes of assessment as well. We identified clerkship grading as a wicked problem, and characteristics of a wicked problem are shown here. Another way to name this problem instead of clerkship grading is really about the tension between assessment for learning and assessment of learning. Wicked problems are useful to understand because they're inherently complex. So when someone tells you, I have the answer to this problem, if it's about grading, you should probably say, no, you don't, because if it were that easy, we would have already figured it out. Wicked problems bring together a lot of different stakeholders. They are connected to a lot of other social and cultural aspects of the environment. And every solution that you think of will have a chain of domino effects throughout the system. So we typically think that we don't resolve wicked problems, but we find ways to manage them and try to bring the upsides of solutions to the forefront and minimize the downsides. Today, I've organized this talk around 4 challenges with clerkship grading, which is the focus of grading debates in the United States. Many medical schools have already moved to pass-fail grading in the pre-clerkship curricula, although I think that these 4 points would apply equally well to classroom-based courses. So I'll start by discussing some of the issues around fairness with grading. Our students tell us messages like this after they receive their clerkship grades. My attending physician didn't watch me see a patient or do this physical exam, but they still rated me on that skill. That's not fair. Or my evaluations are biased. This attending was biased against something about me, and therefore my grade is unfair. So after hearing messages like this from many of our students, we embarked on a research study. And in this research study, we surveyed medical students at 6 diverse medical schools in the United States to ask students 100 questions about their thoughts on the fairness and accuracy of clerkship grading. And we had a survey response rate of over 70%, which we took to mean with a 100-item survey that students really care about this issue. And in one set of questions, we asked the survey respondents, the medical students, based on a scale of 0 to 10, in your experience, how important is each of the following in determining your final clerkship grade from a clinical learning experience? So I'll ask you to just take a minute, talk with someone at your table, or if you're on Zoom, give some thought to these items. What do you think the students rated as highest impact on their clerkship grades? right, I'll invite you back now. You might also have been thinking not only which items students rated as the highest or which you think should be the highest in determining their grades. Across the 6 schools, results were very consistent. Sounds like we have some people who got this right. Students rated being liked and who they worked with as most important in driving their grades. And that's very notable because all of those things are largely out of the student's control. So they feel that their grades are not something that they can determine. In contrast, the things that they rated as least important in driving their grades, their knowledge, their rapport with patients and families, their improvement over the course of the rotation, are all things that we would say are most important to being an outstanding physician or health professional. We also learned through these results that even though the 6 schools had differences in which grading scheme they used or how they determined the grade, that it really didn't matter. The results were the same. If you're being graded, this is how you feel about what's driving your grades. Another thing that educators sometimes think will improve the fairness of grades is to change the rating scale or change the form. And in general, changing the evaluation form or changing the scale will not solve your problem. For example, many students will be rated at the highest level, regardless of what question you're asking or what time of year the student might be doing that rotation. The halo effect involves, oh, is that okay? Oh, sure. Did it move? Oh, okay. Should I take it off? Is this okay now? Okay, I'm fine to stand here. Maybe I'll just keep this since I'm here.
Yes.
Would you prefer? I'll do either.
It's okay now. We just got it back. I'm sorry. Okay.
No problem. Yes, sometimes the dress does not work so well. Okay. Okay. So the halo effect. The evaluator likes the student, so they rate everything high. Or they don't like something about the student, so they rate everything low. We all know, at least in our setting, that faculty are very lenient. They want to be nice, so they give a higher rating. And then restriction of range. If you have a 20-point scale, you'll find everybody still being rated toward the highest level. So there are many challenges collecting numerical ratings and using them in a fair way to assign grades. We also have the larger issue that requires re-education for both our students and our faculty, that when people see a number, they tend to think that that adds objectivity and precision to the rating. You know, this student was a 3.97 and that student was a 3.87. That's a difference. That's important. That might be statistically significant. But we're really learning from studies about how faculty rate learners that those numbers are not as objective or precise or accurate as we would like them to be. And I have a one-slide history of assessment that kind of explains how we got to that point and where we're going next. If you look back before about the 1950s at how health professionals were trained, they were trained largely under an apprenticeship model where a learner worked with someone with experience, and that person might question them sort of in an oral exam format, or might give a written exam to see if they had learned what they were supposed to learn. Then came the psychometric era, the era in which I trained, for example, from about the 1950s to the 1990s, where there was big emphasis on the power of statistical analyses to enable us to measure things and then attach numbers to them. So during that era, there was lots of focus on development of tools, assessment tools, and then measuring their reliability, for example, looking at predictive validity. You know, the score on this assessment had some correlation with a future assessment. High value placed on reliability and validity. And so the measurement itself came to be assumed to be valid and accurate. Our students point out to us all the ways that this is not true, and I just shared with you some of the many problems that arise when faculty try to rate a learner and when we assume that's an accurate rating. So that brings us into the current era where we're hearing about systems of assessment. No one measurement is going to tell us what we need to know, but what if we have the gathering of multiple data points using a variety of tools? What if we look to the narratives not as unhelpful or lots of information to read, but as helpful information that really tell us with more description where the learner is at? The current focus on programmatic assessment also brings the learner into the equation. So instead of assessment happening to them, it's happening with them. They are engaged perhaps by reviewing a dashboard or a portfolio that describes their performance, reflecting on that and telling us how they think they did, so that a group of expert faculty can put all that information together. So out of that current focus on a broader view of systems of assessment comes the need to educate our faculty about the use of narrative in assessment. And this slide builds on work by Nancy Dudek, who developed a rating scheme for narrative assessments. If faculty are describing their experience working with a clinical learner, what content should they address? Ideally, relative strengths and weaknesses so that the learner's compared to your standards, behavior-based information, not, great person or pleasure to work with. How did they respond to feedback, and what are the next steps in their learning? We encourage our faculty to try to match the ratings in the comments. If you said that they have 5 things to work on, you probably shouldn't be rating them at the highest level. And ideally, these assessments, like in a work-based assessment environment, are documented right after you saw the student so that you don't introduce recall bias. But if we really want to make assessment fair, we may need to think differently about how to put together our system. A fair assessment is not objective as the ultimate measure of fairness. A fair assessment system provides learners the opportunities to learn and incorporate feedback. Expectations are transparent. They're not shrouded in mystery about, how does this professor really grade? And in a fair assessment system, again, the learner has accountability. So if things don't go well, they can't just blame the faculty. They really need to think, what did I do that drove my outcome? And increasingly, we're thinking globally, and certainly in San Francisco, that a fair assessment system needs to be not only equal, but also equitable for all of the learners in our program. The literature on how faculty end up rating the learner helps us understand why we'll never get to the point that some of our learners want us to, of every faculty will rate me the same. So whoever I work with, I'll get the same rating. The literature on rater cognition, how raters think, is very interesting. It talks, for example, about why if all of us in the room watched a clinical performance, we might draw different conclusions, even though we all sat here and watched exactly the same performance. One problem might be that we look at different aspects. So maybe if a student was seeing a patient with chest pain, I was focused on how well they built rapport and communicated, and you were more focused on the student's clinical reasoning. So we might rate that differently. Another problem that is an ongoing challenge is you want all of your faculty and your learners to have the same understanding of what meets expectations. And even though we all publish our milestones or our EPAs, we know that our faculty probably don't have them all memorized. And then there's actually quite a complex calculus that goes on when you've observed the learner, and whatever it is you observed, how do you synthesize that and come to your judgment? So this makes us think that it's almost inevitable that our faculty will rate our learners differently. We can train them and narrow that difference, but we'll never eliminate it. So depending on how you explain what causes differences in ratings among different raters, that will lead you to different solutions, meaning that will lead you to different strategic approaches to faculty development. If you have the heavily psychometric belief that the problem with assessor variability is that we just haven't trained people enough to be exactly the same, then you would keep training your faculty, but you would realize you'll never get them to be fully standardized. So training is good, but it will never get all faculty to see everything exactly the same. And of course, every day is different on service, every patient is different, etc. Another line of thinking is that assessors are fallible, meaning they just have shortcomings. So we're going to acknowledge and try to train them around those shortcomings. So ways that we might address that are, for example, training about implicit bias. We know that all people, all humans have bias, and drawing attention to that through training about implicit bias, maybe you have people take an implicit association test, won't eliminate that bias, but it should draw attention that helps mitigate it. You also help address assessor fallibility by making the assessment process easier on them. So if they're working with a student for a week and you give them a 40-item evaluation form, you're making their work harder. If you give them a real-time form that's short and easy to use, you'll probably get better information. And then programmatic assessment, modern approaches bring us to the bottom row of this table. If we assume that raters will vary and that idiosyncrasy is part of the human experience, we have different experiences every day and different people see the world differently, then we want to collect a lot of information from assessors writ large. So lots of different faculty giving small amounts of assessment information, describing it with narratives so that we can learn more about that context, and then having a group of experts like a competency committee or a grading committee pull that together with input from the learner should give us a holistic, well-rounded view of that learner. So I will move now on to equity. And in our experience at UCSF, we knew for many years, since I was a medical student, before I was a medical student, about the problems with grading around fairness, learning, and well-being. But what really tipped us over to redesign our system was largely equity issues, which highlight all the other problems as well. We have an honor society in the United States called the AOA, or Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society, which is very prestigious. I was not in it as a medical student. The top 16% of a class can be admitted, and no one knows why it's 16%. But at most schools, the choice of students is based on their grades. And so these are the students, in the words of AOA, who are most worthy to serve the sick. And one of our students came forward and said it looked to him that the students selected for AOA at UCSF were more white and less diverse than the class as a whole. And so we took that feedback seriously and did an analysis of our data over a 4-year period. And the results are shown here. On the top row are the group of students who self-identified as underrepresented in medicines based on their race, ethnicity in the United States. And the bottom row, the students who identified as not from backgrounds underrepresented in medicine. And what we found at our institution across our 8 core clerkships in 8 different disciplines, all of them showed a very small but consistent difference in ratings of about 1/10 of a point that always favored the students from backgrounds not underrepresented in medicine. So even though it's hard to imagine that that 1/10 of a point difference would be meaningfully affecting patient care, that led the students from backgrounds underrepresented in medicine on the top to be half as likely to earn top grades, again because you've got this range restriction in ratings, and they were 1/3 as likely to be selected for the Honor Society. So we called this the amplification cascade, where very small differences in assessed performance lead to very large differences in important outcomes that drive who gets the most competitive residency or who chooses or is selected to be on your faculty. So we then wanted to understand why we had these differences. Many people said, well, it's the implicit bias of the raters, and that probably is part of the problem, but we thought we don't want to miss other contributors. Since we did this analysis, multiple other medical schools have done similar analyses, and several have published and found the same thing. So it's a widespread problem. We looked at the narratives. When our students were rated in these clerkships, they had numerical scores, and they also had comments submitted by their supervising faculty and residents. So these data come from a study that we did at UCSF and with Brown University School of Medicine. We collected all of the evaluations of students in clerkships, and then using natural language processing, set out to see were there words used differently to describe students based on their gender or race ethnicity. And I'll show you 2 slides of results. Most words were used similarly, regardless of student gender or race, so that's good. But when there were differences, they were important. If you look on the upper right of this slide, you see words that were used differently in the upper right quadrant for students who were women who earned honors. They were described as empathic, delightful, efficient. In contrast, yes, I'm hearing, yeah. On the left upper quadrant, words that were used differently for men who earned honors were things like deeper, scientific, certain. This slide shows words that were used differently based on students' race ethnicity. So in the upper right, words that were used to describe students who earned honors coming from backgrounds underrepresented in medicine, you see words like integral, higher, motivated, native. Whereas in the upper left, students who earned honors and were from backgrounds not underrepresented in medicine, you see words like outstanding, exceptional, stellar, superior. So taken together, these findings are actually very similar to what you read about letters of recommendation for candidates across industries. In general, women and minorities tend to have descriptions of them that use faint praise, so saying someone is competent is less good than stellar. Words that describe effort and workhorse qualities also tend to be used more to describe women and minorities. Whereas for men and non-minorities, there's greater use of exceptional type words, greater focus on knowledge and leadership. So one could say, well, all of those qualities are important. We want everyone to work hard and be outstanding. And I think the take home for me has been when I write evaluations now or letters of recommendation, I try to follow the same format in describing different characteristics for all learners. You know, I don't want to fall into the trap of leading with personality in describing a woman candidate, for example. We wanted to understand our differences in ratings based on students' race ethnicity in a systematic way. So we used a quality improvement approach to understand what might be contributing to differences in evaluations for some learners compared to others, both at the individual and systems level. Our students were very concerned about bias. Also, students told us many of them experienced stereotype threat. That's the idea that if you are aware, for instance, the original research on this was by Steele looking at math tests. If you tell women before they take a math test, women score less well on this math test than men, those women will do less well than if you didn't tell them that. So it's stereotype threat is the fear of fulfilling a negative stereotype, or possibly a positive one, about a group to which you belong. Some students feel a lot of imposter syndrome. I don't belong here, other people do. Representation refers to if I'm a student on the team and I'm the only student who looks like me, that might interfere with my performance. There are broader issues about inclusion, belonging, structural issues. What educational opportunities did a student have before they got to your medical school? So we took issues like this that we had collected by talking with students and faculty in our environment and looking at the literature, and did a fishbone analysis, which is a structured way of identifying all the possible contributors to a problem. And the full paper is listed in the lower right, but I've just shown some examples here. We thought that causes of different assessed performance among different groups of students could fall into student factors, faculty and resident supervisor factors, clinical learning environment on the bottom, or school policies and procedures. And then we started filling in things that could affect all students and things that would disproportionately affect students from minoritized backgrounds. And we continue to work through this fishbone diagram, both as a research agenda and as our implementation agenda, as we work to improve equity and assessment in our environment. One example of an outcome of this work is our equity and assessment checklist, which is a set of resources for people who assess clinical learners. You can Google this, it's publicly available, but we say things like, how do you get started? Have you participated in a training, perhaps on implicit bias? Have you reflected on your personal biases? Are you establishing relationships with your learners? And then we go through examples of some of the common problems in assessment and how you might word a narrative evaluation differently to overcome problems with the way that you are describing a learner's performance. I'll conclude discussion of equity with this definition of equity and assessment that came from a paper that was part of a commissioned series on equity and bias and assessment for a Macy Foundation conference. This is a New York-based foundation that does a lot of great work in health professions education. Equity and assessment is present when all learners have fair and impartial opportunities to learn, to be coached and receive feedback, be assessed and graded, be advanced and graduated, and be selected for subsequent training and job opportunities. So that's really soup to nuts. The entire educational experience contributes to equity in assessment. So I encourage you to take a look at this special issue in academic medicine. Another set of challenges related to grading surrounds learning, how learners approach their learning. There's a lot of enthusiasm and interest these days in promoting a growth mindset. I once heard Carol Dweck, who originated this term, say that one of her great regrets about growth mindset is that it's kind of become a tagline and that people use it when they don't always understand what it means. So I encourage us all to learn more about growth mindset. So use our growth mindset to learn about growth mindset. Growth mindset contrasts with a fixed mindset. A fixed mindset individual believes that they are naturally good at some things and not other things. So if I'm not good at taking multiple choice question exams, that's just something I'm bad at. So practice won't really help me with that. In contrast, someone with a growth mindset would say, I'm not good at that yet. If I put in the right practice, I can learn or do anything. It's not just hours of practice, it's strategic. So getting some feedback, trying it in a different way, seeing your result, adjusting, and doing it again. So while there's a lot of enthusiasm for growth mindset, we all need to understand not only how to actively promote a growth mindset, but also how to recognize all the ways that we speak and approach our work where we might be demonstrating a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. Our learners are very sensitive to the mixed messages that we may impart. So if you are a faculty or a coach approaching a learner, or if you're, a lot of our faculty resonate with this around parenting, if you are talking to your child, you don't lead with, how'd you do on the test? Or, who was the first one to get the answer to that question? If you are trying to promote a growth mindset, you will change the way you ask your questions. What strategies did you try? Where did you feel like you put in the most effort? What was hardest for you about that? How did you choose which to do first? Oh, you tried that and you've never done it before. I think that's great, rather than saying, oh, you got a low score on that. We also want to help our learners engage in goal setting, and I think that's something that many learners will roll their eyes about. One way that we try to make goal setting more accepted in our environment is building in curricular time to do that, so it's not something you have to do on your off hours. Assigning the students a coach so they have someone to support them in that process. Giving them access to performance information so they can reflect with evidence, and showing them that our faculty also have an annual process where we each need to meet with our chair and show that we've reflected on the past year and setting goals for the year ahead. So this is something that everybody does, not just something we make our students do. Competency-based medical education really invites the learners and expects that the learners will be very much a part of the assessment process. So as we are trying to promote a growth mindset, we are trying to harness our learners' intrinsic motivation to learn. They came into a medical or health professions program because they want to be good with patients, not because they want to get A's or honors. So competency-based frameworks, orientation toward a growth mindset help our learners participate actively in assessment by asking for feedback, by figuring out where they want to be observed or where they want to get more practice. This brings in the concept that assessments should be co-produced by the learner and the faculty. That's a systems term that means that you're involving stakeholders in the work as it's happening. And we have had the best success around learner engagement through our coaching program. They think our dashboard is cool, they like that we don't have grades, but they really love our coaches because they have meaningful relationships with someone who is providing them guidance and also showing that they care personally about that learner's advancement. So we are also able to educate our faculty coaches about a lot of these concepts around newer approaches to assessment because our coaches have taken on this role that builds in faculty development time. And our coaching program has helped us create learning communities. As our students receive feedback from their coaches, we've studied and learned how they really changed their whole approach to feedback. Most of them didn't get a lot of feedback in college, which our students do before medical school because they were often in pretty big classes. But they gave us quotes like this, that they used to think all the feedback was strange, but now they find it really useful. They begin to expect feedback. I see an opportunity for growth and improvement rather than criticism when I get feedback. And students increasingly, as they discuss feedback with their coach, become more comfortable soliciting feedback or giving feedback to a peer. So we called that the development of a feedback mindset as part of their approach to assessment. I mentioned the importance of evidence. If you look at the literature on physician self-assessment, for example, it says that physicians aren't very good at self-assessing. But multiple studies have shown if you give people evidence or data about their performance and then ask them to self-assess, they will be more accurate. So without data, it's kind of like guess how you're doing or maybe try to put on a good face. But with data, people can make strategic analyses like, oh, I see I'm better over here in these areas shown in green, but these areas in yellow are areas where I should put in further work. And then ideally, a student takes that information and translates it into a SMART goal, a goal for improvement that will meet these criteria of a useful, achievable goal. So students can develop that habit throughout medical school, working with the support of a coach or other faculty mentor. Students often come into a training program wanting to know if assessments count or don't count. Does this feedback count or not count? And we educate them that really assessments are on a continuum from low stakes formative to high stakes summative. So it's not yes or no, but it's a continuum. So the cooking analogy would be if you're cooking your soup, a low stakes formative assessment would be tasting it and determining it needs to cook a little longer, it needs more salt. A higher stakes summative assessment would be after you served it, someone said, I don't like your soup very much. But even a high stakes assessment can be formative for the next course or the next set of learning activities. We have built in work-based assessments, which I'm hearing you're also interested in doing, and that itself entails students understanding that anytime someone watches you in the workplace and documents it using a work-based assessment tool, it's not a high-stakes performance, it's supposed to be for your learning. So we have a form that can be completed after such an observation that's accessed on your phone using a QR code. And we continue to educate our faculty about how to give feedback, collect evidence by observing the learner in the workplace. For feedback, we use the keep, stop, start framework. What should the student keep doing? What should they start doing? That's the next step. And what should they stop doing? That's something that needs correction. And after that feedback is documented, ideally, there's another observation. The last area I'll discuss around grading challenges is around learner well-being. I think you're very aware of learner well-being issues because you're having this session today. In the United States, most schools moved to pass-fail grading in their pre-clerkship classroom-based curricula about 20 years ago now. Not all schools, but many. And there have been many publications, including surveys of thousands of students and reviews of the literature showing that pass-fail grading in pre-clerkship curricula led to similar knowledge outcomes. So students learned what they needed to learn and better well-being. So that really has entrenched this practice at many medical schools. In the clerkship phase, the downside of that is then that the clerkship grades become even higher stakes. And what happens when you change clerkship grading to not be tiered in a way of ABC or honors pass fail? When we interviewed our students at the time of our grading change, we found that many aspects of their well-being improved. Their stress level went down. They felt much more able to be their authentic self in the clerkship environment rather than putting on a performance. They noted improvements in their physical health, mainly around sleep and somewhat around exercise. And they felt much more agency to make decisions about how am I going to spend my time in any moment? Like, am I going to read for the exam? Am I going to see a patient? Or is it just time for me to go home? So we see many benefits to pass-fail grading in clerkships. We also have the challenge in our environment that students apply to residencies in a way that's very high stakes in a match process, and they want something that distinguishes them, as do their residency programs. So we have a 3-phase curriculum, and we've settled on pass-fail grading with emphasis on feedback and a lot of formative assessment, as well as periodic summative assessment in the first 2 phases. And then we continue to use honors grades in the career launch phase, which has worked well because it's when students are most close to applying to finishing the program and applying to residency. And we have found that those grades in the final phase do not demonstrate the equity issues that we had earlier. So giving everyone that formative learning year took away the equity problems that we had earlier in the curriculum. We continue to build other opportunities for differentiation. Your grade is actually a pretty poor measure of who you are as a person. It's very blunt. It doesn't give any detail. So we spend a lot of time on the things that will show with more narrative description or other measures of accomplishment who you are and what you could bring to a training program. A personal statement allows a student to describe things about their background that could be used as more of a holistic way of looking at an applicant. This change process is a process that requires a lot of attention to your faculty. Many faculty think about assessment the way it happened whenever they were in training. A lot of them will hold dear the idea of a meritocracy. Well, any grade that you earn is based on how hard you worked. So we educate them. Well, maybe it was based on privileges that you had or another learner didn't have. And we also educate faculty that maybe their sense that they can identify the best and the brightest might have its limitations. Often when faculty say that, it's not as accurate as they would think, or it might reflect their affinity toward a learner who kind of reminds them of them. So we educate our faculty not only to promote a growth mindset in learners, but also to think where they might have growth opportunities around their approach to assessment. A talk on the learning environment would be a whole nother talk, but I'll just mention briefly when we think about assessment and well-being and really all the aspects of the grading change that you are pondering, think about the learning environment. If learners have different opportunities to learn or practice or see a patient, they will be assessed differently. If they experience a microaggression when they show up, and someone says, okay, now I'm going to quiz you on the 5 causes of X, they probably won't answer that quiz question very well, even if they did have that knowledge. So we continue to work hard with our faculty on all sorts of skills development, and our faculty find this hard. How do you create psychological safety? Starting with including the learner, but then making it safe to ask questions. That's learning safety. Safety to speak up or even challenge, hey, I think this patient might benefit from something different. That's hard for faculty who might be used to a more hierarchical environment. How do you as a faculty member demonstrate cultural humility if a student comes from a different background, or maybe the student and the patient come from a different background than you? And we do a lot of role play and practice and trainings around responding to microaggressions. They will inevitably happen. Many of them come from our patients. And how does the faculty respond to that in the moment? How does the learner respond? What does the learner want the faculty to do or not do? So wrapping up this talk, I have 2 more slides. Assessment that moves us away from grading is part of a change to assessment that is conducted very differently than many of us experienced in our education. We are moving away from an older model of assessment that had a primary purpose of ranking and sorting into smart people and less good people. In that older model, feedback was typically infrequent and not very descriptive. Often feedback and assessment were decontextualized, meaning we're going to have you see patients and then test you primarily with written exams. A modern approach to assessment would capitalize on the opportunities of assessment to promote better learning, with the assumption that all students admitted to our institution have the capacity to learn and become outstanding professionals. They all need frequent, descriptive, immediate feedback, and they need a lot of their assessment to be happening in the context in which they will someday practice. So a change to pass-fail grading, which we recently made at our institution in the clerkship setting, can improve fairness, equity, learning, and well-being. A focus on assessment for learning helps our learners to get used to and become skilled with feedback and have agency over their learning. Transparent expectations and robust procedures for assessment help us be rigorous. We're not making things easier or softer. We're making things better so that our learners develop competence and so that we fulfill our accountability for our programs to our patients and the public. And with that, I will conclude and be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think a very, very interesting talk. One of the key questions that's playing in my mind is around feedback. So in theory, it's very easy to say more feedback, better feedback. In practice, for a faculty member who needs to do a lot of grading, it's easier to categorize someone, move on to the next student, rather than give lots of rich and immediate feedback. So how does this tie in with trying to also make sure that, you know, it's not just an ideal state where a faculty member has enough time to give lots of rich feedback?
That's a tough one. I think we have really tried to not expect everybody to do everything, but think about that individual's role, how involved they are in education as a faculty member, and what was the context. So for our coaches, for example, these are faculty who are paid and trained to do this role. They learn lots of detailed information about feedback, sophisticated frameworks. They do lots of workshops. They should be expert at feedback. For the frontline teacher who identifies as mostly a clinician or mostly a researcher who periodically supervises students, we expect them to directly observe the student if they're going to give feedback. Like, well, if you're going to give feedback on history taking, you should observe that student taking a history, but maybe it's just 2 minutes of that history. And then when you've observed something about the behavior that you can comment upon, you can stop or later on give that student feedback. So trying to build the skills in a way that fits the role and the capacity of that faculty member.
Thanks.
I know we've got a large number of colleagues online who are joining us, and I think there is a question from one of our colleagues at ANU. Dorothy, do you want to read that for us?
Yes. This is both, but I'm not sure if you can hear it. I'll speak to both. There's a comment first, which leads to a question. Accepting that rater variability can be mitigated by increasing data points, but too many assessments have compliance importance issues. So the question is, what is your advice on deciding on the optimal number of the low-stakes workplace type assessments?
So that gets into reliability issues, and there have been studies using the mini-KEX or other tools about how many assessments do you need to get a reliable rating, meaning one that you can kind of count on. And it depends who did the ratings. Like from faculty, that number might be like 10 to 12. But say you were collecting ratings from patients rating the student, then it's something like 50. So that becomes somewhat unfeasible. Now you might say then, but I still want ratings from patients. I think that's sending an important message about what we value. Or maybe we want peer ratings. You know, the reliability for peer ratings is in between what you need from faculty and what you need from patients. You might say, well, I'm going to collect these, but then we're going to look at them as part of a larger portfolio of assessments. Or maybe we're going to collect them and ask the student to write a reflection, and that's what we'll use to contribute to the grades. So there are other ways to use the information that could still be helpful for assessment purposes.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? I see one there. Yes, Alison.
Thank you so much, Karen. It was a fabulous presentation and I think a lot of transferable insights. I'm from a Faculty of Science and I've got a question around, you mentioned lots of approaches to bringing faculty along, but is there one piece of advice or one must-do activity where you're perhaps experiencing some reluctance to the approaches that you're taking?
Yeah. Well, I think leaning in and talking to the faculty is probably what I would say. There are different ways that faculty resist, and certainly we see that. One is just the global, anything new and different is too much for me. I'm very busy, and now we've got, post-pandemic issues. A lot of them really are looking at the world as it was when they trained, so trying to bring them along by asking, what have you heard from your residents? What have you heard from your kids' schools? That will show them a little bit different how to think about things. We have also had some success trying to do some of this in the departments. I'm an internist, I'm a medical education dean, so maybe a surgeon might hear it better from a surgeon. So the surgery clerkship director, or we also have an academy, like the surgeons who are in the academy might be better suited to bring faculty development to those people. When we studied the faculty perception of our grading change, and when we asked students and faculty, we actually kind of uncovered, we hadn't really asked the residents, but the residents really got it. I think just having recently been students themselves and also having experienced some more current approaches to learning and schooling, the residents also have been allies sometimes with training the faculty.
Thank you.
I wonder if I can ask you a question while we're waiting for
And I
another
also saw
question.
one in the back.
Oh, did you see one in the back?
Yeah.
Oh, right. So while we're getting there, I'll ask you a question. So this is quite a culture change in terms of what the academy thinks is in terms of what the students think about assessment. Has that influenced how you'll intake students into the program?
Yes, I think if you make a change, you definitely need to support the students who are already in the program, because when we made the decision, changed it while we had some students who were about to start their clerkships. And it was funny because some of them said, how could you make such a hasty decision? And we said, we've been working on this for like 20 years and accelerated our work for the past 4 years. But a lot of people don't know all the work you've been doing. So attending to those students, like they were very concerned if there was a pass grade, if someone thought they might have been eligible for honors because someone might not know when we made the change, or they thought, it's unfair that I was admitted under a different set of policies. So those students need special support, but that goes away pretty quickly, once they move through the program. And then you're left with students who knew your school's approach when they chose your institution. So if they really didn't like your approach, they could choose a different institution. We have found that our yield, meaning the students who are accepted to UCSF who choose to come, has gone up since we made the change, although I think it's important to say other things have changed in our environment too. So it's hard to say what contributed, but we have found overall that it's, when we see like on Reddit and other sites students use, that it's viewed favorably.
That's good. Question at the back.
Thanks, Karen. Just two quick questions. In your medical program, when you make a grading decision, how do you make a judgment on competencies which are hard to be graded, like professionalism and cultural competency? Or is it a portfolio-based assessment system that you have? And second question is that what is the future of programmatic approach to assessment in United States, which is heavily influenced by licensing examinations? Thank you.
Great questions. So we use committees for all high-stakes decision-making. So we use grading committees within courses, and then we have a progress committee that looks at the students about twice a year longitudinally to make sure they don't have like a lagging competency, or the student who just barely passed everything and clearly needs more support. So the grading committees start with an assessment plan that they design within the course, working collaboratively with the assessment team, which is my team, so that we have a common approach to assessment across all the pre-clerkship courses and all the clerkships. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar so that we can follow trajectories. And some activities like around professionalism might just be things that are required to do, like a reflection activity or something. So not every competency might be assessed with equal emphasis in every course, but that's where the longitudinal academic progress committee would put all the data together. And then around licensing exams in the United States, things have changed. Our Step 1 exam, which was a very high stakes medical knowledge exam, went to pass-fail, which was a welcome change. And secondly, our national clinical skills exams was dropped. And I think that was a combination of cost and logistics and like the juice not being worth the squeeze. So schools are able to move more now to programmatic assessment, and we are accountable to the LCME, which accredits us, and then to the residency programs who take our students and give us feedback through surveys about whether our graduates performed as expected and as billed in their application.
Thank you. We'll take the final question from someone who's online.
We're slightly past time, and this was a similar question. So it was, what is the procedure for students who are borderline between pass and fail? And is there a system to alert students who are at risk of failing? And what is done to help support these students?
So it's interesting, we talked earlier that when a lot of people hear about pass-fail grading, they assume it's easier and they worry that you might pass more people who should have failed. But I would actually say it is the opposite in our system, and it should be the opposite in a competency-based system, that if you are truly focused on assessing competence and achievement of your expectations, then using a pass-fail grading system kind of compels you to gather more data, to involve the learner more. So that helps with the learner having a better sense of how they're doing along the way, and helps you identify with more data if someone has met that minimum standard. We definitely have students who don't meet it on any one assessment. We were talking earlier that often students who repeatedly aren't meeting expectations really have a lot going on outside of the academic environment, so that's where you pull in your mentors, your support people, your dean of students to figure out what's really the underlying cause that we can help address. So I'm happy to speak further about that offline.
Thank you for that. And I do want to invite Professor Merlin Crosley to make some closing remarks and thank Karen for her wisdom.
Thank you so much.
So thanks very much, Karen. That was sensational. I grew up also before the 1990s, and so I'm in a grading mindset. I mean, I have to say, when I saw you put the Golden Gate Bridge up, I thought, there it is, the second most beautiful harbour bridge in the world. Because that's the way I was always brought up, that I rank everything, and I'm in a mindset of ranking everything. But you've absolutely helped me to see the world in a completely different light, where we don't sweat the small stuff, where we give people the opportunity to differentiate themselves by choosing what they love and excelling. We support them, and we don't get led astray by this idea that we can get these exact numbers and we don't waste our time. I mean, I was amazed that you haven't been grading the first, year and a half of medical schools for 20 years. I hope we can catch up and perhaps overtake you, And I think we have to do grading. There was a very select committee that graded the applications for UNSW visiting teacher fellowships. And we graded them very rigorously indeed, but only because we were overwhelmed by applications. But once we've got them in, I mean, I'm sure you're one of the best, but we won't be grading you. You're definitely the first. So we're trying to balance this. We're trying to balance grading when we have to and not grading when we don't have to. And you've done it. And I think we can learn so much from you. This is what it's about. And the final thing I want to say, I loved your slides. I love the simplicity of your 4 boxes: equity, fairness, learning, well-being, and student well-being. And I think as a university, we're trying to dedicate ourselves to student well-being. But we are also, and these seminars are actually about staff well-being. Because if we have a community of staff who are working together, people are emerging as the leaders, people are supporting each other, then that translates to a good experience to students. So I just want to thank the people who've got you here, Arvin, Adi, and I want to thank the people today, Nalini, Patsy, who are leading the A&T Education Academy, all the people I know. I'd love to get to know all of you. Many of you I recognise in the audience, all the people online. Someone from Melbourne tried to join and couldn't, but I think it'll be available on YouTube forever. So, but I want to thank everyone who sustains these lectures, everyone who manages all the organisation, and I've just given the whole event an A+. Thank you.